10 to 7 is the time right now. I'm RC Marcusa. You are with 89.3 FM 990 on your AM dial. It is Winnipeg's #1 radio station. Well, there's a special reunion coming up this weekend in our city of refugees who came to Canada on a ship that was called the Beaver Bray. It brought more than 33,000 people from Europe who were displaced after the Second World War. And the event this weekend is being put on by the Canadian Lutheran World Relief, an organization that was founded to help refugees after the war. It's part of 5, in fact, events being held across Canada, but the one here in Winnipeg is coming up tomorrow. Now, people like Rick Sauer's parents were on that ship. They came to Canada in 1948 on the Beaver Bray, and Rick's in studio this morning. He's going to be attending the reunion tomorrow in Winnipeg. Good morning.
Morning.
So your parents now, I understand, Rick, have passed away.
Yeah.
What do you know about why they decided to get on that ship in the first place and come to Canada?
Well, they needed an opportunity for a fresh start. They had been in Germany after coming from Eastern Europe for 3 years, and things were not improving. Through Lutheran World Relief and the Red Cross, they had been put in contact with family that they knew lived in Alberta, one of my mother's aunts. And by connecting with them and then getting them to sponsor them through a family sponsorship, they were able to come over.
Did they talk about the voyage at all, what it was like on the Beaver Bray?
Oh, yeah. My mother was quite vivid about that. She was violently seasick for all 11 days, and she said it was one of the most horrible experiences. My father was fine, and so they talked about that quite a bit, the negative experience there. However, the positive was, one of the main positives was they were able to meet some other families who became lifelong friends, and we're still in contact with one family to this day.
Really?
Yeah.
That connection point must be very deep when you think about what that voyage meant for them. I mean, risking everything.
Oh, sure, yeah. Sharing experiences, where they'd come from, how they were trying to rebuild their lives, and shared experiences were really very important. Yeah.
What did your parents come with?
They basically each had a suitcase, and I think they had saved up a slight bit of money, but mostly they were dependent on organizations like the Red Cross and Lutheran World Relief to be able to get passage, also relatives, and they had almost nothing, and they knew no English. They had limited education. So.
Why did they want to make a new start in Canada? Did they talk about that decision?
Well, yeah, they were basically uprooted from their home because they had grown up in a German farm settlement in the Ukraine, and that was all now behind the Iron Curtain. Family was all scattered all over, the ones who survived all over Europe and the Soviet Union. They just needed to get a new life. They had really no family where they were at in Germany and no roots there.
Where did they settle in Canada? Where did they end up settling?
Well, they went to Alberta near Drumheller for the first year, but then also connected with an aunt on my father's side who lived in Vancouver Island. And so then they went out there to live there and basically settled in British Columbia. My father started a business, trucking business.
What do you think it's going to be like tomorrow to be in this group of people?
Well, it'll be interesting because I actually have not connected with a lot of people who have experiences like mine, and or people who are the previous generation who came over. So it'll be very interesting to hear their stories and their experiences.
Are you taking anything with you, like photos of your parents, or are you going to bring anything with you?
Actually, that's a good thought. I should. I have
just
some
wondered,
that I could bring, to dig up and bring with me, and to share sort of my background and experiences and hear what others have gone through. Yeah.
What is the value of what your parents went through for you when you put it in the place of what that risk that they took?
Well, on a personal level, I mean, it meant that we grew up as Canadian citizens. My brother and I were both born here, and with a very deep, strong appreciation for our nation and the freedoms we have here. Also a deep appreciation for, I think, refugees now. The Syrian crisis is huge, and what those people are experiencing and how they're just trying to build a new life, trying to get away from a horrible situation where life is threatened and be able to find a place where they can live in peace. And I can connect with that knowing my parents' story.
Have an enjoyable time tomorrow. I think it has all of the makings of being quite an event this weekend here in Winnipeg. Thank you for your time this morning.
Oh, thank you. Thanks.
That's Rick Sauer. His parents came to Canada in 1948 on the Beaver Brae. That's a ship that brought more than 33,000 people from Europe between 1948 and 1954. Now, there is a reunion I mentioned this weekend in Winnipeg. I want to give you some detail about that. It's being put on by the Canadian Lutheran World Relief, which was founded after the Second World War to help people who were displaced. You heard Rick talking about it. The reunion will include more recent refugees to Canada as well. So if you're interested in learning more about sponsoring refugees, you're also invited. You can learn more information there. This is all happening at the Lutheran Church of the Cross. It's at 560 Arlington Street. So 560 Arlington, and it is tomorrow from 2 to 4 o'clock. And it's free. So if you want to head out there from 2 to 4 o'clock. As I mentioned, 5 reunions of this type are being held across the country through the weekend. Heather Wells is joining us now with news headlines. I have to mention this, Heather, though. You and I both have Ukrainian descent. We had this moment at a family dinner once when I was growing up where my Baba and my father's stepfather, now imagine completely different sides of the family, were talking in Ukrainian. I was a kid, I didn't know what they were saying. And all of a sudden, I just saw them going, oh, whoa, no. They came over on the same ship.
Oh, my goodness.
So they found this unbelievable
connection.
And
they just realized
point.
It there.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So all these stories. I remember in Halifax going to, Pier 21 and rifling through to try to find pictures of the ship. And
oh, my goodness. You know what? I've spent time in archives here, trying to find out and
go back to the roots.
Exactly, yeah.
Should be a wonderful event tomorrow really for these folks.
We've talked so much about refugees in Canada in the last little while. And I would predict that once the election is over, that conversation is going to settle down and it's going to fade away and it'll go into the background. But the truth of the matter is that this country has done a reasonable job of welcoming refugees over the years, many of whom came to Canada right after the Second World War. And in those days, a lot of these people were called DPs, which stood for displaced persons in Europe. And it was a kind of a negative label that was hung on people if you were a DP. You were kind of less than. You were a lesser than kind of person. But millions of people, of course, as we know, died in the Second World War, but millions as well were displaced, had to flee the countries of their origin. Many wound up here in Canada and made great lives here. And there's going to be something of a reunion this weekend. And to talk about that today, this sort of fascinating coming together again of those who came here after the war. I'm joined by Pastor Rick Sauer, who's with the Canadian Lutheran World Relief. Rick Sauer, it's kind of a neat story because when you think of all of the people who came here, many of whom with about $10 in their jeans, and wound up making lives here. There's some extraordinary success stories.
Yeah, that's true. My parents, I guess I would classify as two of them. The reunion is of people who came across on a specific boat called the Beaver Brae. My parents came across in spring of 1948 with 2 suitcases, grade 5 and grade 8 education, no English language skills. My father was able to build a business in British Columbia, successfully raised me and my brothers. So,
where was home for them, Rick?
Well.
Where did they come from?
Well, they came originally from a German farming settlement in the Ukraine, and there were lots of them out there. And then as the war progressed, they were displaced first to Poland near the German border, and then they had to flee from the Soviet army. And my parents were fortunate enough to make it to the American zone, and so were not sent to the labor camps in Siberia. There they worked on a farm as laborers for 3 years, and then were connected with an aunt of my mother's through Lutheran World Relief and through the Red Cross. And then were able to get sponsored and come across to Canada.
What kind of life did they face here? Because, of course, Germany we just finished a war with Germany not 3 years before that. And so what kind of a welcome did they get here?
Well, they said it was better than I think they expected. There was some suspicion in that, but partly because they had a lot of family connections. And out in Alberta, there was a fair-sized German community where they first settled. it wasn't that difficult. They found the prairie weather, a little more daunting, and learning the English language in general. My mother said she faced some in her workplace, faced some discrimination or snide remarks, but was taken under the wing by an English cook, a man from Lancashire, and who really protected her. So they had good experiences overall.
You know, and I grew up in a neighborhood where a lot of the kids that I grew up with were themselves kids of folks just like that who had come from Germany or Poland, some from Denmark, and a couple from Lebanon. I mean, people had come from all over the Western world to make this country their home. And so they could have, I suppose they could have gone back at some point, but they chose to stay. Why?
Yeah. Well, my parents were quite definite. Their experience through the war, and also the fact that their homeland was not accessible to them to return there realistically, and their family was scattered. So they were quite positive about Canada, about the opportunities, about democracy. There were so many things they said positively that they never considered going back, even when they discovered they had some relatives living in Germany. So,
you know, it's interesting. We talked a little bit about gun violence in the United States earlier on the program, and there's the old argument that Americans need to carry guns to make sure that they don't come under the thumb of some kind of a tyrant. And so we talked a little bit about that, and somebody suggested that in fact George Bush was a tyrant. I think your parents would have laughed at someone like that. These are people who had to flee the Soviets, right? Who had to flee Joe Stalin. And they would look at a guy like that and say, you want to see a tyrant? This is what a tyrant looks like. So you can understand why so many people would have fled that part of the world.
Oh, yeah, and I think back then and over there, the ethnic lines were still drawn quite tightly, and they had already lost in the 1920s and 30s their farmland and most of their religious freedoms. So they understood what it was like to live under a tyranny where, you know, your property, your land was all confiscated, and basically they had to go underground with practicing their faith too. So. And that was all free here, even though there were many different faith backgrounds and denominations. So they really appreciated that.
All right. There might have been, it's not that there was never any intolerance or bigotry or racism, but not to the point where it impeded your day-to-day life.
Not for my parents. And I think it's possible for some others, you know, of different ethnic backgrounds, but they managed quite well. They built relationships, and not just with fellow Germans, but with you know, the larger community, the church community, the business community, and the towns we lived in, mostly in northern British Columbia. So I wouldn't say they found it impeded in a great way at all. So no.
And so tell me a little bit about this get together then. Where do people go? Where are they going to hook up?
It's at Lutheran Church of the Cross, which is on Arlington Avenue, just north of Ellis. Sorry, I don't know the exact street number. And it's from tomorrow afternoon from 2 to 4 p.m. And it's a gathering of people, some people who have just come over on that ship, not recently, but who came over on this ship, the Beaver Bray. And also I'm a descendant of that. And it's a time to connect and remember, and I think also share concerns about where we're at now and how we can build a better society.
Pastor Rick Sauer, thanks so much for being with us and sharing your story.
Sure. Could I clarify very quickly? I'm a pastor of St. Mark's Lutheran Church. I don't work for Canadian Lutheran World Relief directly. So, anyways, but I just thought I'd clarify that.
All right, and I thank you for that, Pastor Mark.
Thank you,
Pastor Rick Sauer. Thanks very much for that.
Thank you.